Great. So we're ready to plunge in here.
You're ready to plug in.
It's so great to see people from all across the country. As you'll see in the website I'm getting ready to show you, that we have the whole country in there. And you'll see that Virginia's played a big role in all that by depopulating itself for many generations and helping to populate the rest of the country. I'll tell you a little bit about this. So I'm a historian of the American South, and I was invited to give these lectures at LSU and on Southern history. And those are usually like a 100-page book, 3 lectures. And I said, hey, what do you say instead that we make I have my own copy, Mark, I appreciate the pitch there, but what do you say that we make a book that has almost 100 original maps and is published the size of a coffee table book and full color? And they said, great, let's do it. So many thanks to LSU for letting us do this. It's possible because I've been doing digital history since really the very beginning. I had a website 6 months after the web was invented almost by accident. And I created a project, some of you may know, the Valley of the Shadow, 2 communities in the American Civil War, which is fundamentally genealogical. It's every piece of information that we can find about every person who lived in a northern community where Chambersburg, Pennsylvania is, and a southern community where Stanton is, Augusta County in the Valley, through the entire American Civil War. It took us 14 years to build it. This was at UVA where I was for 27 years. And I've written 2 books out of it, In the Presence of Mine Enemies and The Thin Light of Freedom, which basically try to tell the story of the Civil War, emancipation, Reconstruction on the ground. It's got thousands of letters and diaries, and it took me almost 1,000 pages to tell the story of just those 2 counties. So as you can see, I'm basically a genealogist in disguise, except as people have pointed out when I've been going across the country doing research, I don't know anything about my own family. And so I just want to be honest with you. I'm pretty sure that we're from Virginia in the 18th century, but then sometime in the 1820s and 30s, they went down into the mountains of North Carolina, as high up as you can get. We're in the shadow of Mount Mitchell in Yancey County, North Carolina. And we're there until the 1950s, when my mom and dad, after my dad had gone to Korea at 18, came back, and they moved exactly an hour north to Kingsport, Tennessee, the greater Tri-Cities metropolitan area. But every weekend or every other weekend, we would go back and visit our families way up in the mountains. And my grandmother didn't have a telephone until I was 15 years old. And I'd go out and watch her, kill the chickens for dinner and things. And so it was a little bit different than living in the suburbs of the Tri-Cities area. And I didn't know it, but I was becoming a historian then. If you'd told me when I was in college or anything that I would be studying the past for a living, I wouldn't have believed you. But I won't tell you the full story about all that. But anyway, so I've been doing this now for quite a few decades. And as I had this chance to talk about whatever I wanted to talk about in the South, I decided to see if I couldn't use the digital world in a new way. Now, all of you know how your field has been transformed by computers. And I have a lecture that I give about genealogy and history and the relationship between the two. And when it was that Ancestry began and its ties to the Church of Latter-day Saints and all that. It's now the second most popular hobby in America after gardening, I understand. Whereas history is the most widely taught subject in American schools, but you may have noticed is a subject of great contention still. That people, and it just shows you how much it matters. So my purpose in all the history that I've done is try to include everybody in the story. That's the whole point of the Valley of the Shadow. Let's put everybody, men and women, soldier and civilian, black and white, deserter and general in the same story. And so with Southern Journey, I decided to make it even more democratic than that, because the one piece of information, as all of you know, that everybody has left in the historical record is in the census. And even as far back as 1790, we know if there were white and black people in every county of the United States that was in the United States. And so that tells you something too, that we thought that of the many things that they could have recorded, the main thing they record was race. That's the one constant we have from 1790 to the present. So taking advantage of that, we're going to be able, I'm going to show you, tracing the white population as it moves across the South for 230 years. And even though the lecture title says we're stopping in 1914, I'm going to sneak ahead a little bit and bring us right up to the present. That's the case. Another bold thing about this book coming up to the year it was published. And then also the enslaved population, the Black population after emancipation, and then the immigrant populations, especially those from Latin America and those from Asia, and to make the story of Indigenous Americans a key part of the story as well. So it's unusual. We tend to divide American history up into racial and ethnic groups and into regions and into centuries. And so I decided, now that I'm old, I'd do whatever I wanted to do. And what I would do was to stretch across time and space. So I think those of you who are represented from other states in the country will find yourself here. I'm going to share my screen now and tell you about what I'm going to show you. And it's this one, and share. And somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Mark, you've been my ally. I appreciate this very much. And your talk sounds really fascinating too. So I may have to check in for that. Fellow Tennessean, I'll be at East Tennessee. And as we know, that's one of the other three stars on the flag who do all this. So I want to begin by pointing out several things about this. First of all is the website. You can see all of this later, not while I'm talking. Now, I'm a teacher, so I'll know if you're looking at it when you should be listening to me. But you can certainly check this out later. It's DSL, Digital Scholarship Lab.richmond.edu/Southern Journey /. And you can find it just by searching. And this, you will notice, has several things in common. First of all, it is two other authors on here, Justin Madron and Nathaniel Ayers. And since you're all genealogists, you will not be fooled when I tell you, yes, I'm related to Nathaniel Ayers. He's my son and is actually responsible for how beautiful these maps look. He's a designer. And you can see the medals that we have done there. Look at that. We won the award for the best cartography from the National Convention of Cartographers. And we also won the International Cartographic Association recognition of excellence in cartography. And so this just happened about 6 weeks ago or so. And I take no credit whatsoever. So my role in all of this was to say, hey, Justin, hey, Nate, can you imagine ways that we would show the population change of every county in the South and later of the entire United States over 230 years in ways that would reveal patterns much smaller than counties? And they helped us invent this. So if you like what you see here, that's because Justin and Nate made it. If you don't like it, it's still because Justin and Nate made it. So don't blame me for anything. So, but you can see how beautiful this is. And LSU then making this book, and I'm really not trying to sell the book, but to see what it looks like, and they sold it for less than $40 is really pretty amazing. So here's the basic idea. We'll start with this, and we're going to cover a lot of territory. Areas that are blue are areas where the population of that ethnicity is declining. Areas of varying shades of gold is where the population is increasing. So what we're seeing here in the first decade that there is a census, Eastern Virginia is already bleeding white people. People are leaving Virginia in large numbers. Now, these early maps, because we can talk about it later, I only show the South up to 1860, and then in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we switch over and show you the whole United States. But the fact is that it would bleed out a lot of the interesting patterns if we showed the whole pattern. And since almost all African-American people, well over 95%, live in the South before the Civil War, this is why we would do it. So what you're seeing here is this is the first, and the genealogists among you will recognize what's happening here. This is the settlement of the first extension of the South, of Bluegrass, Kentucky. And this is Daniel Boone going down the trail in the Shenandoah Valley, hanging a hard right at Cumberland Gap and going up into Kentucky. You'll also see this is one of the few times that my native East Tennessee is growing. This is partly because it was on the route to Kentucky, but they could also hang a left and you go to the other big boom place, which is upcountry South Carolina. You go into Kentucky, you're going there to basically have this beautiful, rich land. They're not growing cotton. If you go to upcountry South Carolina, this is when there's first beginning the cotton boom. If you're going to East Tennessee, you're probably on your way to somewhere else, okay? But you can also see Eastern North Carolina is depopulating as well. So areas that are Black are areas where the population is relatively static. So that's what white population looks like. Now you'll see this is going to be a pattern we're going to follow. Same decade, Black population. So what you see here is that Eastern Virginia, the Tidewater, enslaved people are being moved to the Piedmont. Okay, so they're being moved to Albemarle County, to Thomas Jefferson's Monticello and so forth. They're also being taken to the bluegrass of Kentucky, and you can see that they are now growing in the coastal regions of South Carolina, which is really booming at this time because of rice, long staple cotton, and some other cotton as well. So you can see this is Eastern Virginia helping to populate Central Virginia and the Piedmont of North Carolina. So this is the way that we'll move through this and to tell the story. You can see here how the depopulation of Virginia is really increasing. So this is right after the golden age of Virginia, of course, right? And this is right after, this is Virginia still supplying presidents to the United States in the Great Virginia Dynasty. But you'll also see, you see what I'm talking about, East Tennessee, how it's already depopulating. They're moving there to Mark's area of Central Tennessee, the Great Cumberland Basin around Nashville. And so the first place that the South expands is actually in the Upper South. They're going to Kentucky and Tennessee. And you can see how already some of the people who moved to upcountry Georgia are leaving, and upcountry South Carolina are leaving. You can see how much it's young people. I saw Mark's topic, Go West Young Families. This is what this is. These are young families that are just beginning, who are setting out, moving across the Appalachian Mountains to establish new parts of the South. Now, if we look at compare, this is one of the cool things that you can do on this story map. This allows you to compare back and forth. So you can see this white population I just told you about, but look at Black population. Whereas the white population is distributing itself in order to look for land. Again, Mark's talk, coming up, landless farmers. The one thing that people want, if you can imagine today, if you just told people, yeah, if you'll move for 12 hours, you can have a free farm, we would be seeing it today. Unlike today, which we are living in the least mobile time in American history right now. I don't know how many of us are aware of that, but we are staying in place more than any other time in American history. But what you can see is that while white people have the opportunity to spread out, Black people are being taken to places where the plantation economy is growing. You'll see something here too. Look how early, far, far removed from the East, Louisiana and Mississippi are growing, because this is the sugar plantations and the very first outpost of cotton along the Mississippi River. It takes less time to get cotton from Natchez to Liverpool than it does from large parts of the South that are closer to the East, because New Orleans is the great port. So as you can see, there's more in all these maps that I can show you in this one talk, and my goal is to kind of give you a broad overview. One of the things that you can look at is, there'll be a link here to this map. This was the inspiration for the entire book. My friends at the Digital Scholarship Lab at the University of Richmond, made this before I thought the book up. This shows you the forced migration of enslaved people, and you can go to any decade and see how it's changing. And you see every one of these is an individual county that shows, you can click on any county, which county is growing so fast. That's the low country of South Carolina, right? Which counties are growing faster. You can see it's middle Alabama, we'll talk about that. You can see which states are growing most rapidly. And what you can see is that this is Virginia. Virginia is always going to be losing more Black and white population than any other state. So you can go look at that again later, because you'll miss what's going to be on the quiz if you go look at that right now, but later that you can, okay? Now you're starting to see this is Black population change. you're starting to see it move into what we think of as the Black Belt and all along the Mississippi River. Now, look how fast this is happening. This is as if this has happened since 1990 in our own time. This is the massive population shifts of American history and of the American South. So people imagine that the past was slower moving or simpler than our own time. No, it's to the contrary. And you can see already how places like Kentucky are not really growing nearly as fast because you can have these places. Now, why would this be growing? But you'll see here too, you see where the white population is growing. This is where they're leaving this part of Georgia and moving into this part. They're settling this part of Alabama, but not Mississippi. West Tennessee is booming now. Some of you are going to guess how we explain this pattern. But for those of you who don't guess, I'm going to show you. Okay, this is one of my favorite maps. All of these areas are lands that are occupied by the American Indians as late as 1814. Okay, it's going to play several times. You'll notice the entire South is occupied by indigenous people for all of that time. And you will have noticed that white people move into the areas that are taken from the American Indians, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, across this time. I just don't think people have an understanding of this. We understand the Trail of Tears, and we think, up where I'm from, and we'll talk about that. But this is important to understand. If you want to understand the patterns of the settlement of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida, and Western Tennessee, you need to understand indigenous history. So this shows you population density by 1830. You can see how the places, the Cumberland and Bluegrass, but also the oldest parts of the Piedmont, but much of the South is still relatively empty. You'll start seeing how the North is much more densely populated. By 1860, the North is twice as densely populated as the South. And that's in large part because if you have enslaved people, you can have a much larger farm than you can otherwise. Market's a mystery about why slaveless white people also have larger farms. It seems to be just a kind of a preference for, first of all, there's so much land taken from the Indians, but it also seems to be a cultural preference. But what you'll see here, look at this. What this is showing is that enslaved people are being taken from this part of Georgia, which is already being worn out, to the new areas that are being taken from the American Indians, okay? You can also see how by this time, coastal South Carolina, which had been booming, is now in decline as far as Black people. And this is going to be one of the two peaks of the sale of enslaved people out of Virginia. Now, let's think about Virginia for a minute. Virginia is going to remain in 1860 the largest slave state, the state that has the most enslaved people. But it is also the state from which the great majority of enslaved people are sold. So people who do Black genealogy need to really, we need to make every source available that we can for Virginia because this is kind of the mother of the Black population, because you can see where they're being taken in the Black Belt and the Mississippi Delta. Those of us from Richmond know about Shockoe Bottom and know that this was the second largest industry in Richmond, was the sale of enslaved people. Okay, you can see the prices really begin to mount in the 1850s and continue to do so, which is an interesting challenge for all the 3/4 of white Southerners who do not own enslaved people. What are they going to do? Well, what we'll see is that they are, you can see here, I won't repeat everything, you can look at this yourself. They're beginning to move into Mississippi, which by this point has been taken from the Chickasaw, right? I just hear thunder here. Let's just assume that this storm is not going to knock out Zoom in the middle of my talk, okay? Okay, now here I want you to notice this. This is white population change. White people are generally moving to areas where Black people are not. Why? Because Black people are being taken where the land is most valuable and most expensive. And if you're a landless or a slaveless white family, you're going to go where you can afford land. And where you can afford is northern Alabama, northern Mississippi, Arkansas, and Texas, because those are the places land is affordable. Because here in the Black Belt, what you would see would be, look at that. What this means is, and you still see it being taken from Virginia, what this means is if you're a well-to-do Virginia family, what you're likely to do is help set up your younger daughter or son, and they're likely to go get some of this new land in Alabama. This is the richest land in the United States, the Black Belt. And it's growing cotton, and it's the largest export in the United States. It counts for 80% of all American exports. Okay, so that is. I'm going to pause. Before, I'm going to show you just a couple things, and then we'll pause, and I'll see if there are questions. This is going to show you something. This is the foreign-born population of the United States. This is one of my favorite maps in American Panorama. We'll pause for a moment. You can click on anywhere in the United States in any year, and it will send out tendrils to all the places where people in that county were born, all the way back to 1850. So you click on it, and it changes, and it shows you all the different. This is Worcester, Massachusetts. I'm guessing there's going to be a lot of Irish people there. It's going to come. It's taking. Oh, okay. I pushed the button too fast. There we go. So you can see this. So those of you who are interested in genealogy and interested in have people from not born in the United States, this allows us to come up to the present and see all this. You can see how great, how brilliant my friends at the Digital Scholarship Lab are, and how much I'm just riding on their coattails. But I'm the one who gets to talk to you tonight, so that's okay. Now, here's a really interesting pattern to think about, and maybe y'all can help me understand it. Areas that are shades of yellow is where there is a majority of males among the enslaved population. Areas where they're green is where there's a majority of females. Why is that? Well, you'll see when the big sugar planters of Louisiana are purchasing slaves, often from Richmond, they are buying over 90% men because they're working on these brutal sugar plantations. If you are a small non-slave holding family and you're going to buy one person, chances are you're going to buy a woman who's more useful in every way, plus you own her children. It's a better investment, right? So for most of the South, Black women predominate. Why does Virginia have a majority of males? I think because of all of this. I think that they are being bought from Virginia. So that's a pattern that we just discovered with all of these numbers, and you can see how we'll look at the cotton again here in a minute. But also try to explain secession. It turns out that all these areas that are green is where population is relatively stable. Those people don't want to vote for secession. The people who vote for secession, and so there's no correlation to slaveholding. Okay, if you're already rich, you don't want to rock the boat. But if you're from northern Mississippi, northern Alabama, southern Mississippi, Arkansas, Texas, chances are the population has been growing there. The brown people who vote to secede. So look at Virginia, the largest slave state, the mother of slavery, votes against secession over and over again until it does secede. Then it becomes the capital of the Confederacy, and then it becomes the battlefield, and is devastated by the war. That's another subject that I talk about. So does anybody have a question or two about the antebellum period before we go in and see what happens after the Civil War? Yes, Mark.
I wanted to say, I love as I was reading this, one of the pages I've stopped and spent probably days on is the map you showed previously, which is the relationship of enslaved men and women. And what I found really interesting is I began to focus on the areas that I knew something about. So like you're talking about in Middle Tennessee, it's very clear that, for example, that orange and those two yellow counties that are just to the northwest of Nashville, those are the three counties where there is iron ore and smeltering operation. It's the only place in Tennessee where we have the old-time bloomeries are still growing, Montgomery Bell. There's big iron industry, and that's the only place where it is. And I'd never thought about, and most of the male slaves from even our area were leased out and were working there in 1860, and I'd never thought about it. And this really, really, thank you, because it makes so much of this come right down to the county and location, and we've never seen this information in this format before. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I want to talk just briefly then about, since you're kind enough to do that, let's talk about how this works. These are smaller than counties. These are called hex bins. Why? Well, as you well know, county boundaries are constantly changing, right? So this is a way, these are defined by latitude and longitude, and then through using mathematics through the computer, it tells us in areas that are independent of county boundaries. By merging various statistical information about the counties, we'll be able to see these patterns that are smaller than that, right? So you can see that there's a growth of that area there, Mark, but still, I don't know what's happening south of Nashville. That's probably in the 1840s, but but you certainly can see the growth of Black population in a land just taken from the Chickasaw, right? Doing all that. So the whole idea is that this is meant to be useful to genealogists because it shows you big patterns that we couldn't see otherwise, but it also shows you smaller patterns than you can see. And it's meant to do just what it did for you, Mark, which is to raise a question, which you will answer. The computer just made that map after I asked it to, right? It's not like I was trying to show anything. So this is kind of being able to use computings for history the way they are for science, for exploratory. So let's look at what happens after the Civil War. Excuse me while I scroll back up to the top. So you can see this whole thing is made in something called Story Map, and it does just what we said. Now, as Mark's pointed out, Story Map doesn't have all my priceless words in it. So I spent years trying to translate all this into words. And then when we made this, we just left it off, then it wins a big prize. So it suggests who's valuable in this is not me, but I do try to explain these different patterns on. So here's a map that I like very much. This is all the places where the African-American people came into contact with the United States Army. And we just put up a beautiful new statue of emancipation in Richmond this week. And somebody wrote me and said, well, actually, the Pulitzer Prize winning editorial writer said, well, did the Emancipation Proclamation really matter very much? And I said, well, yeah, all these people become free because the United States Army is there. And so this is a cool heat map that reflects it. We're not going to talk about this. This is about the refugee camps during the war. I'm seeing lightning outside my window. It's very dramatic. Here's very interesting patterns. What we see is that Black population change. My internet connection is unstable. You can see that I can't hide that from you. Black people are migrating away from the plantation districts during the war. Okay, and that's white population change. I'm sorry, that was it gone so fast. White people are moving away from Black people right after emancipation and moving to the Upper South. Black people, in kind of surprise, are moving to the Black Belt. Why? Well, everybody's heard of sharecropping, right? Well, if you get half of what you grow, it makes a lot of sense to leave the worn out lands of Virginia to move to the rich lands of Alabama, where if half of what you grow is going to be yours, you'll have a chance maybe to establish a farm of your own, which is a great goal. And by 1910, 80% of Black farmers in Virginia own their own land. They earn it piece by piece. The quote goes that we had the back ribs and spare ribs and backbones, but they had their own land. Here, you'll notice that the Mississippi Valley and Virginia are depopulated because these are the places where the United States Army was for so long, and people used the opportunity to leave. Okay. So this is something I write about, that this is the area where, look how fast small towns grow between 1880 and 1900. I wrote another book called The Promise of the New South, Life After Reconstruction, in which I really pointed out that much of the South that we know today was actually created between 1880 and 1910. Look at this. Okay, so we saw before, that's where cotton was at the time of the Civil War. This is where cotton is by 1910. Look how much more cotton the South grows in 1910 than in 1860. So what you see too, look at the Black Belt and white population. White people are fleeing the areas, including almost all of Virginia, where the Black population is predominant. But the Black population, and this kind of shifts over to show how this is changing. The spread of the boll weevil, this pretty cool map, the growth of this, suddenly the cotton industry. Those of you who have family in central North Carolina and South Carolina, and this is why my family moved from Western North Carolina to East Tennessee to work in a plant, as we called it back then. Now, what you'll see here is that what people don't realize is that this is when white people begin moving to the cities of the South. You see Birmingham growing, but this is when the great departure of the countryside for white people happens. And what happens too is that, you know what we call this is the Great Migration, but it doesn't look anything like the maps in the textbooks, which are a big red arrow going up the Mississippi River. Instead, what do you see here? Two things happening simultaneously. Black people are fleeing the Black Belt. Cotton prices have bottomed out. They're moving to cities, Atlanta, Macon, Birmingham, all now we know the I-85 corridor, Piedmont. This is Greensboro, and moving now to Texas and already Florida. Jacksonville is booming. But this is where they're moving most. This is the Great Migration. And generally, Black people are moving directly north to where the railroad lines run from where they live. The fastest way to get, finally, for the first time in their lives, there are jobs open to them in the north. And why? Because the immigration from Europe has been stopped by World War I. At the same time, America finally needs the labor of Black people and gives them a chance. So this is the beginning of the Great Migration. What people don't realize is that more white people than Black left the South in those years. It's a larger proportion of Black people who leave, but more white people. So those of you from all other parts of the country are welcome to enjoy the same maps now. This is when we begin to show all your patterns. And you'll see that, you know, the Midwest is becoming depopulated, upstate New York. So Virginia's still kind of stagnant at this time. But, you know, look at Michigan, other places. They're beginning to change. People are moving to the cities of the South. And what you'll see here, watch how the Great Migration continues. You may remember very briefly, I showed you the boll weevil map. It's moving to the east. So now is when people from Georgia begin moving to all these cities. So the Great Migration is actually several decades long. Midnight train to Georgia and all that sort of stuff. You know, this is from the migration later. White population, people moving to cities, people beginning to move to Appalachia. This is the big boom area when coal is actually very valuable. This is when tourism begins in Florida, begins to really grow, and the cities of Texas begin to grow. You'll still see that white people are avoiding the Black Belt, and that Black people are avoiding it as well. So this shows you in greater detail. One of the things I really like is being able to show the impact of World War II is when the South in many ways turns around. But here's Black people leaving in the 1930s. So even though this is where I told you I'm going to cheat and go after World War II briefly, this shows you quickly, okay? This is World War II. Actually, more Black people leave the South during World War II than they do before, because the same jobs, right? But look at this, how the South is just depopulated. 1950s, the same pattern. So the Great Migration takes place over 2 full generations. The 1960s. But now it begins to change. For the first time in American history, more Black people begin moving to the South than leave. And that is the dominant pattern now, is that for the first time in American history, Black people are choosing to move to the South. More Black people have moved to the suburbs of the United States since the 1970s than moved in the Great Migration. 85% of the Black people in Atlanta live in suburbs. Okay. And you start seeing the cities growing. Okay, and that takes us back to the beginning. White population, this is when the patterns that we're used to today. Look at what's happening during World War II. People leaving the farms, moving to these places. Often the South really benefits from federal spending during World War II. But now look at my beloved Appalachia, just being devastated. And this is where my family moves, this little tiny area here that's growing, the only place. But in general, Appalachia, Western Tennessee, all the Black Belt, white people are leaving. You see where they're moving to Florida. 1960s continues, Appalachia bleeds, Florida continues to grow. But now, what we know now, the great migration of white people of all different ethnicities to the South, especially to Florida, but also look at the size of these cities in Texas. So that's another thing about this method. It shows you the distribution of population. It's not just a dot, but shows you how big Atlanta is growing, all these places. And so what the South that we live in now is basically an urban South. And this is kind of a cool map where you can, it shows you the growth of the interstate highway system. And as you know today, if you want to actually understand where people live, it's like, what exit do you live on? What Cracker Barrel are you near? Pretty striking thing here, if we look at, these are people from Latin America from 1990, 2000. You see, we're not surprised that they moved to Florida and Texas, but also the Piedmont and Atlanta. But 2000 to 2010, this is where a lot of people are moving to chicken processing plants. They're also moving to suburbs and that they are moving across the South. So the South has a quarter of all the immigrants from Latin America. Similar pattern from Asian Americans, except it's almost entirely urban. You see the difference between Latin American and Asian population? And so you see now how almost all the population growth of the South is in the cities. You'll recognize this pattern. This is playing out in our politics now. So those of you from Virginia know we have a gubernatorial election coming up. Look at this. This is the crescent that supplies so much Democratic votes. These areas of population decline are the places that supply Republican votes. And this is why we have 2 Democratic senators, a Democratic governor, a Democratic legislature, is because of population growth in the South. This kind of is jarring. So you might want to avert your eyes a little bit while this explains how all these different kind of things happen. So I'm getting ready to turn to you and ask for questions. I'm going to show you right now areas that are blue is where the population is growing. Look how much the patterns that we've seen for 200 years are still the patterns of today. You see areas that are yellow, is where population is declining. It's the Black Belt. It's the places that were ravaged by slavery, that were once the richest part of the United States and now the poorest. The other is Appalachia, which has been struggling for generations with depopulation. You know, my own family worked in Detroit, as we called it, and took the Hillbilly Highway. You can see it's not very far from Western North Carolina to Detroit, and they would work there. But the fundamental problems of poverty are basically anywhere in the South are demographic. It's where the population is declining. There's not enough young people to supply the hospitals and the schools and so forth. Now, this book came out, and this is just very interesting, quickly show you. One of the fastest growing ethnicities in the United States today is American Indian. And it shows that it's growing in the areas for which people were driven. This is a mystery. The Lumbee people of North Carolina are still there. The Creek people who were driven out of that area are still there. Choctaw, and then Cherokee. See? And I was talking to a leader of the Cherokee Nation. He says, yeah, every white person imagines they're 1/16th Cherokee, which has been the folklore in my family as well. Why is this growing so much? Because now people are able to identify as more than one race. And many people are claiming racial identity with indigenous people, which, given what I showed you before, how it was their displacement that created the South did this. You'll see the same patterns I was saying before. This is the Democrats, the Republicans, and how that's changed. But the thing that I wanted to show you, so this is patterns of poor health in 2016. You'll recognize the pattern. This is patterns of people living below the poverty level. And you can see these are the direct results of these patterns over the last 200 years. I finished this book in spring of 2020. They let me put this map in there that shows how COVID first came to the South. And this is areas where slavery had been strong. You see what it looks like now. Now it has migrated to the upper South. Kentucky and Tennessee, I just came back from Louisville yesterday, are the most heavily infected places because of low vaccination rates. So, but it's moved. But the point of all of this is, and as the introduction of the talk said, family history, individual history, and these mass movements are all so closely woven together. My hope is that seeing these big patterns will help you understand your own family's patterns. So, for example, to be able to understand that more people who left Virginia, more white people, went to Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois than went to Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia. Okay, so large parts of the Midwest are settled by Virginians, but then again, so are large parts of why do you have Berkeley and Richmond in California, Oregon? And so the book I'm writing now is about the United States from 1810 to 1860 and trying to show how it was that who settled Oregon. It's the people who left the Midwest because it didn't deliver what they'd hoped, a decent farm. So they're willing to go all the way across the United States to settle Oregon. So my argument is this: the central theme of Southern history is movement. Directly contradicting what most people think is that it's the old home place, it's a static place. In fact, the population of the South has been the most volatile population of all the United States. When you look at it in the broad picture, Black and white people, largest growth of foreign-born people, constantly changing and churning, the growth of cities, the growth of suburbs. And so anybody who's going to understand the South, people who are going to understand their own families, as you've already discovered. And in fact, as the membership of this talk shows, you have to take a national vision and set it all in motion. So I will answer whatever question I hear, but people unmute and speak. So go ahead. You can't possibly have believed all that. So let's.
Dr. Ayers.
Yes.
I am from the eastern part of North Carolina. I live here in Virginia now. And I read somewhere that there was very little slavery in the eastern part of North Carolina. Do you have any knowledge of that?
Well, I do have. That's not here's what's lacking. So here's Black population change in the 1830s. And you can see Eastern North Carolina, I just learned this recently. You cannot grow cotton back then in Eastern North Carolina. And so the only really profitable industry is the tar and pitch industry, which is why we have Tar Heels. It's like redneck. My friends from North Carolina, I've heard made up stories about the Civil War and Revolution. No, it's really because Tar Heels, you're barefoot walking through the eastern districts. North Carolina, Eastern North Carolina, and Western North Carolina, so I'm from right here, basically any people who had the money purchased slaves. They found something for them to do. So what I just learned is the whaling industry begins to decline in the 1840s and 50s because they learned how to make fuel out of turpentine and pitch that they use in lamps in the North. It's much cheaper than whale oil, and it's used by enslaved people. As Mark was telling us about, as soon as you discover a little bit of iron ore, enslaved people are brought there. So compared to South Carolina or Virginia, there are fewer enslaved people in Eastern North Carolina than elsewhere. So that's true. But any person of property, any white person of property would have held enslaved people. It was the advantage. It was the way that you could actually, without enslaved people, you can't really become well-to-do. And so the great majority of people who held political office would have been slaveholders. And so I hope that answers. But North Carolina, the phrase was North Carolina is a valley of humility between two mountains of conceit between Virginia and South Carolina. And really? Again, as a native North Carolinian, a mountaineer, I take pride in my identity. But slavery. I hope that answers your question. But
Yes, it does. And I just had one other thing to say, and you answered pretty much that when you were talking about whites moving rapidly, I guess, to the places where they needed to be employed and have some land, because they were. I taught African American literature for some years, and I had to start off with information that my children would understand. And I told them, they just assumed, just like people today, thought that all whites owned slaves. And I told you had to have money. You could not do so. You had to have money in order to do so. And that's why a lot of the times they moved, because they were poor,
That's right.
And that would be the real answer. Yes.
Yeah, and they're looking for land. And that's
Right.
that's true with Texas, and that's why they vote for secession. They don't want to be precluded from more chances for land. So that's the paradox. The big slaveholders don't want to secede. The people without slaves do. And so and then North Carolina ends up supplying more men per capita than any other southern states, including some of my ancestors. This just shows the truth of what you just said. If the enslaved population is the most rapidly growing, so you're basically priced out. If you're a slaveless family, you're not going to be able to afford that one woman who's going to help in the kitchen and in the fields too. And so this is another thing, kind of leads to a crisis in the 1850s. I see.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see a hand from.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi. What did you just mean by they purchased slaves to find them something to do?
Well, I don't think I would have said that. I'm not sure what that would have meant, but can you remind me of the context in which I said that?
Well, you were talking about the North Carolina and the part that didn't have.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, what I just said. So what I would say is that in our minds, slavery is, I ask people when I go out and give talks, so what does slavery look like? And the great majority of people says, from our textbooks, it's Black people standing in a cotton field, right? But as Mark just pointed out to us, enslaved people are in coal mines and in turpentine factories and in racetracks. And so people who do own enslaved people are looking for the best way to employ them. And if you live in a city, often what you would do is like Richmond, a large part of the Black population is hired out to like a tobacco factory or to somebody else, and then the owner gets all the money. And so you are looking, if you're a slave owner, what's the most effective way to use the most valuable thing that you own, which are people. And so that's what I meant by that. So in Eastern North Carolina, many people had left, but those who remained, they could put enslaved men, especially, to very productive use in the turpentine industry, creating this new oil for lamps across the country. Thank you for the question.
Dr. Ayers.
Yes.
This is Robin Jones, and I wonder whether you considered Maryland a part of the South when you're looking at your 19th century population. I mean, I didn't really see it. And also, is there a way to overlay education or poverty? Are those two things kind of correlations? Thanks.
Well, first, you're right about Maryland. Maryland is actually seeing is pivoting away from enslavement at this time, and you would have seen the Black population is embodied in Frederick Douglass, for example, is rapidly decreasing. Maryland has a lot more free Black people. So if we go, to into the 20th century, you can start seeing Maryland being a part of all this story. And so, this is there's a white population change. Anyway, so Maryland enters the story after the Civil War, but before the Civil War, it's not generally considered a part of the South, even though, as you know, it's divided during the Civil War, men fighting on both sides. Your second question was, can you remind me?
Yes, about whether there is a correlation in poverty and education or lack of education.
Yeah, here's the thing. The white population of the South is one of the most literate populations in the world. There's only 3 countries in Europe that are more literate than the white population of the South. It turns out that the white population of the North is the most literate population in the world. But you got these stereotypes, and again, speaking with hillbilly resentment, this idea that we were illiterate is wrong.
Wow.
Yet, and an average white Southerner per capita was wealthier than the average white Northerner. So slavery was, if you add it all up, right? Now, what this means is an average white farmer like my own family would have differed little from an average white farmer in the North, right? But what they could be is that they could borrow an enslaved person from a nearby slave owner, or they might be able to rent and be able to take advantage of that way. But the average farm and literacy and poverty. So the white South was not poor before the Civil War. Why does it become poor? Population growth. And why does Appalachia suffer so much? Okay, so you can see white population change here in this map that I'm showing. The largest families in the country are Appalachian families. What that means is if you're like my family and you have a 60-acre farm and you have 8 kids, well, it doesn't take long for them not to be a family farm. And so what happens? They leave. They go to town. They go to the textile mills, or they go to Texas. So, but this idea of the antebellum South was not poor. It becomes poorer over time for white people because of these kind of fundamental changes in demography. Now, Black people, of course, become free with virtually nothing but the shirts on their backs. And one of the things we need to remember is that the formerly enslaved population of the South is the most successful formerly enslaved population in the world. In terms of literacy, in terms of property, but they get it all themselves. They earn these things themselves. And by the turn of the century, you'd have 70, 80% Black literacy, starting from virtually zero because it was illegal to be taught before. So I think these questions, when you do go in my final map and I show poverty, what you will see is that the South does have a disproportionate share of poverty, but it's mainly because of outmigration, in which the places are hollowed out, and the only people who are left are the older people who are not. So this is poverty. Actually, this is poverty. It's a direct legacy of slavery in the Black Belt, and a legacy of exploitation of Appalachia by people taking all the coal and the trees in the Upper South. So, we're looking at Southwest Virginia and Eastern Kentucky right there. And we all know about what coal did, but the other places are a direct result of slavery. What else questions do we have? These are great questions so far. They're hard. That's okay. I'm ready.
You had a question in the chat box. Have you gone into cities like Richmond to see how many skilled workers are enslaved? Have a butcher from the Second Market in Richmond who had $50,000 of personal property in the 1860 census.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know something about all that. I would say this, that that's a great anomaly. But there have been a large number of free Black people in Richmond. And I think 3,000 or 4,000 free Black people, and they could acquire money, often by catering to white customers, the butchery or barber and that sort of thing. But if you were enslaved, the great majority of your earnings would be taken by your owner. After the Civil War, those people who know Richmond, like a lot of southern cities like Durham, the Black population, basically by buying and selling with themselves, created a Black middle class very rapidly. Their own press, their own churches, their own schools, and under segregation, which begins really to take off in the 1880s and 1890s, it kind of creates a buffer in which Black families are able to prosper by dealing with one another. What it also does, of course, is keep them from a fair share of schools and being able to vote and lots of other things. They put all their energies into raising money. So there would have been, I think you raised a really good point. The Black population, especially in a city, and they're very different in every city, different proportions of well-to-do Black people and really quite impoverished Black people, often divided in some ways by skin shade, because of the advantages that you might have by being related to a white family. You might be able to get a start with a business. But you'd also find the First African Baptist Church of Richmond, which is the largest congregation in the city, that you'd have free people and enslaved people it's illegal for enslaved people to be married. So they can't legally be married, but they would, in the eyes of themselves in the church.
Ayers,
Yes.
the person that I was talking about is actually white.
Oh,
The butcher was white, but I'm fairly certain he owned a number of people that were probably trained to work for him.
yes. And that's a great point too. I like the point you were making that I thought you were making, and I ran with that, but I like the point you're making now. And so after emancipation, those people can use those skills, right, to start their own businesses. That's how you can have that district. But yeah, that's kind of addresses the point before. How would you use, so if you're a butcher and having skilled slaves, oh my goodness, that's a great business. But you would find in making iron and all other kinds of things, you would have found enslaved people doing that work. So that's a good point. You would find that's interesting. I see Paula coming on. That's a sign that I've talked as much as you all can stand.
No. You the night is yours. We will stay as long as you'd like to stay. But
I will answer questions as long as you all can stand it. Okay.
I turned on the camera because there were a couple of questions in the chat box. One of them is a follow-up about the literacy rates, asking if those are for today. She had plenty of illiterate ancestors in the 19th century.
Yeah. I would say that the South, because it did not create public schools, actually fell behind the rest of the country steadily over time. In Reconstruction, when Black people finally got in power in Virginia, for example, they created the first public school system in the Commonwealth. So before this, people would educate each other or these little academies, but Black people were beyond it. So I'd say that illiteracy probably doesn't increase, but it doesn't decrease as we would have hoped over time, because the South just doesn't invest in infrastructure like that. Okay, what else we got? You got other questions in the chat?
The other question in the chat box, sorry, Donna, you can be next. Can you touch on the effect of laws on migration patterns, such as free Blacks not being allowed to live in Virginia? My ancestor attempted to free his slaves by buying land in North Carolina for them to move to.
Yeah, you have a paradox. It was illegal for free people of color to live in Virginia, and yet they did. Because often if you would have a kind of a white sponsor, you could stay in Virginia, but you had to register every year and you had to pay a small fee, and you had to carry at all times a certificate showing that you were free. And yeah, after Nat Turner's Rebellion, 1830s, Virginia comes pretty close to actually beginning abolition, and instead decides to clamp down on Black people and make it illegal to read or to gather and things like this. So it became much harder to be enslaved after 1830 than it was before, with laws holding it in place. So, but here's the thing too, is that probably tens of thousands of free Black people did migrate from Virginia and Maryland into the cities of the Northeast, to Philadelphia, New York, and so forth. But slavery was basically locked into place by these laws. I think that's a fair statement. Manumission becomes much less common in 1850 than it had been in 1810, partly because instead of emancipating people, you can sell them, right? The market is so big. But if you didn't want to emancipate them, you were often saying, well, you're going to have to leave and not be with your family because you might be married to a woman on the next plantation or whatever. So it's really, white people entangled themselves in it as well. as Black people and limited their freedom of conscience. So, is there another question in chat or another question?
There is, but Donna has her hand raised, and I think she had her hand raised first, so we'll go to her
Okay,
first.
Donna.
And I was wondering what plans you may have to continue updating the data, bringing it forward, and in particularly using the data that's going to come out next year of the 1950 census.
As it turns out, that data this is aggregate, not individual data, right? So I'm showing you this because this is a case where we can bring, you see the stops in 2010, right? So we will be able to update this because people will be very interested to see where this goes. So I do think that we will add to this and to see if the patterns of that I've spoken about in the South continue. But the DSL, let's see if I can. There's a whole series of maps that are constantly changing, and I hope that you all will explore these as well. So this is, so I'm still kind of answering your question to show you how every congressional election by county, by district, from the beginning of the two-party system up to the present, we'll be updating this with 2020 data. We're also going to have a new map that does, and you can see this has all the sophistication you find on election night, but for any county and any district. See, look at this and how it flipped Democratic, Republican, and that's so cool, So my friends at the Digital Scholarship Lab who have done American Panorama are constantly updating these things. So their most popular one is the one on redlining, which every city in the United States that I think it's going to take me to Richmond. And what you'll see is that these shows you how the cities became segregated. This is the federal government working with the banking industry to say that these districts that are red or where Black people live generally, you shouldn't loan people money. So you're not able to actually build the wealth. We continue this all the way up to the present in other maps that of this one, the legacy. So look at this map. Again, I can brag on this because I had nothing to do with it. Just look at this, I'll show you Richmond again. Look how beautiful this is. You click on it, and this is a map I just showed you from the 1830s. Here's a map of Richmond today. You can click on any area and it shows you how it's changed. So here's an area. Isn't that amazing?
This technology is incredible.
Well, this is why it's called the Digital Scholarship Lab, and allow me to brag on the University of Richmond, who is on the cutting edge of all this. It's 3 people, Rod Nelson, Nathaniel Ayers, and Justin Madron, who are using all this. These maps are being used all over the United States by Zillow and others. That I spoke to a group of realtors who want to talk about, covenants and why our neighborhoods like. Those of you who know Richmond will recognize the West End, right? And you see it started out rich and white, and it's still there. But you can see how the fan, right, which was in the 1930s was considered marginal because it was going over to rental units. It's now the fan is now Monument Avenue. Okay, so we are constantly updating it, but from aggregate, not from individual census. So I don't know that we'll be doing anything with the 1950 census, but because back in the Valley of the Shadow, it is all the individual census. Those of you, I don't know if you'll be able to remember what this was like, but we typed in the entire manuscript, population, agricultural, slave owning, and manufacturing census for 1860 and 1870 for 2 counties. Imagine typing in those things so that we can search it. So we know about individual data, but this is aggregate data.
Thank you.
Okay. Paul, I'm going to ask you to do, will other people with hands, will that turn up at the top of the list, or do you have another question?
They should.
Okay.
I noticed you noticed a hand raised earlier, but
That's
I
right.
don't know if you always see them or not. In the meantime, I will ask the question that was in the chat box: is how it was typed back when you were talking about the education. How would
Yeah.
you compare early education in the Ozarks to that of Appalachia?
It's a lot to sing. And it's something to think about. I've wondered why my family would leave Eastern Virginia, and you've got all of the United States. They find the highest holler in North Carolina they can possibly find, where there's not basically any level land. Well, if you've ever been there, you see it's so beautiful that they value something other than the greatest amount of prosperity they get. First of all, they value not going into debt, right? So if you can get this free land, that if you can clear it, right, and the wood is worth a lot, and you can make it. So when I was growing up, they were tobacco fields, right? But you want to be there. So if you're leaving Appalachia, where do you go? You skip all across Tennessee to go to a place that looks like Appalachia. You go to the Ozarks, right? And I value that. You know, I think that they know how to grow what will grow there, but they also recognize it as familiar land.
Yeah, I remember a similar lesson that actually Mark Lowe taught about. They went to similar land, but then some of my ancestors did what you were talking about, is go to total opposite, so chasing whatever opportunities might be available regardless of the land they were used to.
Yeah, and the spirit I bring to all this is I respect whatever choices people make, right? These are maps of people choosing, of white people choosing, and then after freedom of black people choosing. If you're looking for democratic maps that include the most people making their own lives, this population movement is the most important decision that most people will make in their lives and in the lives of their descendants about what their prospects are going to be. And so I see all this, you know, like when you get an MRI and you kind of see what's going on inside. This is like an MRI of the country, and you can see the big patterns. And what it shows is that I really do resent the idea that people from Appalachia or the Ozarks or the South in general are less ambitious and less, you know, this chapter is called South, constantly moving to better themselves. And so, you know, the book Hillbilly Elegy, I just hated so much because of the patronizing tone of my people, that you couldn't say this about any other ethnicity in the United States, but you could say this. I think to show why Appalachia has been poor is not because the people are lazy or illiterate, but because of the situations in which they found themselves. So I would say that there's a lot of literate people in Appalachia and the Ozarks. You don't really have the big infrastructure of public schools and things that you do in other parts of the country. I'm sorry, I'm showing my patriotism here a little bit tonight, you know, but the point is that I value all these decisions across all the country. And I think I'm going to end with this. One reason of putting recent immigrants in the same map is to remind ourselves that they are motivated by the same desires and hopes and dreams as the ancestors of white people and of black people, right? Is that why are they doing this? They are moving in order to give their families a chance. So my hope is if we go back and think about if we're from the South as I am, from the early 19th century, and we value the decisions our families made and we see the consequences, that maybe we'll bring some compassion to people who are trying to create lives for themselves now. And so I did all this because it was the most democratic history I could think of. And you'll notice that half these people have something in common with some of you on this call. They're women, right? So this includes women as active agents in history as well. And I think it's important for us to understand that. So with that end of my little sermon there, I will set you all free. But the other thing I want to say is that most of what we're able to do as historians is enabled by people who do genealogy. The libraries wouldn't exist, the archives wouldn't be sustained. We wouldn't have a lot of the resources that we use to understand the past if it wasn't for the genealogical community. So we're cousins, historians and genealogists at least. And some of us don't have the good sense to study our own families, but to study other people's families. And you'll just have to be patient with us as we do that. But I'm really grateful for the chance to talk with you all. And I hope we get another chance to talk down the line.
Mark's holding up the book again.
All right, okay. Makes a wonderful gift for any occasion. Anyway, so thank you all very much. It's great talking to everybody tonight.
Thank you.
You're getting some comments. Thanks for championing Appalachia, if I can even pronounce it.
You said it right. Don't say
yeah,
it.
no, it was the championing that I was getting tongue-tied on. Thanks. Yeah, somebody just ordered the book, so that's good. You're getting lots of comments. How do we reach you via email?
Ayers@richmond.edu. And I have you can search Edward L. Ayers. I have a Squarespace site that shows the different things that I'm doing. So I'm easy to find. Okay.
Excellent. And I did post some things in the chat box earlier. So if any of you want to save the chat before you go, you can get that stuff.
Yeah, do be sure to visit dsl.richmond.edu. You can see all these maps. And I think you'll find that great resonance with the work that you're doing because it has the same purpose, this connecting the past and the present for the future. That's what.
Speaking of the chat box, you might want to look at one, the last comment, it was the last comment when I started talking. If you aren't already familiar with it, you should check out the BYU Record Linking Lab, similar big data projects with genealogy records.
Yeah, well, as I was thanking people, want to be sure to thank the Church of Latter-day Saints because we wouldn't be able to do any of these things without the remarkable work of microfilming and all that as well. So I will definitely check that out. So I appreciate that tip. I'm all about big data, and I'm writing a lot about the history of the Mormons right now. Fascinating to talk about a migration and to see this. So I'm going to click on it right now and look at it as soon as we're off here. Anything else you want to call to my attention, Paula?
I'm answering a question that's asking me to repeat something. So,
okay.
The meeting was recorded, and we will be sending an email with a link to where you can view it again. Let's see, just more thanks. I can't save the chat for you. You have to save it yourself. But lots of thanks. This is wonderful.
That's right.
Wonderful presentation. So thank you very much.
All right. Hey, yeah, I appreciate all of these exclamation points, folks. I really appreciate it.
How long did it take you to assemble all this initially?
Well, it's interesting. I keep saying I'm like the guest who says he's leaving and then is not, but I'll answer questions and yes. What's amazing about this is that the answer is a couple of years, but the data already exists. What didn't exist was a way of imagining it to be able to see it. Because otherwise, all the other studies of migration, if you just sort of added up, say, Georgia, right? Well, it doesn't show you any of the variation inside of the state. Or if you think about Virginia, right? You don't see that great migration from Eastern Virginia to the Piedmont, and then from the Piedmont to Appalachia, the coal mining later, right? And so state data obscure more than it reveals. And then the way the census does it, the Southeast doesn't show you anything. So the idea here is let's break through that crust, get as close to the ground as we possibly can with aggregate data. That's what we're trying to do here, right? So that's why Justin and Nate really invented this way of doing it. We had to go through many drafts. It's not like we just made this up and they would make it and I look at it and say, oh boy, I think the cut point here needs to be this. Or it took us a while to find out this cool blue and gold theme, right? So it works across all ethnicities and to be able to show that, and also to gather the data across the whole United States. So that's the cool thing about this is that we have, because the last 20 years of work, we're just now beginning to think about how we would do things like the Brigham Young Project that might kindly call to our attention. We're on the cutting edge of new ways of seeing the past, and genealogists have been have made a lot of that possible. So I'm really grateful for that. But so it was hard. This is the hardest writing I've ever had to done because I've never written about an image. How do you say? And then it gets kind of lumpy there, and then it kind of thins out there. And so when you look at the book, you'll see that the ratio of books I had to read to what I actually said was remarkably high. It's like a bullion cube. This is so concentrated because I'd have to read 10 books to understand the things like Mark pointed out. Oh, there's an iron mine in Central Tennessee. Who knew that, right? Being able to explain some of these anomalies. That's the way it would generally work. I would make a map and then I would look at it and go, what's going on there? That's how I learned so much about chicken processing. I didn't know all that, in Arkansas, in Tyson's. Where did that come from? How did that develop? So I think that all of these maps are created to raise questions more than anything else. And I hope, to illuminate an individual family's journey. You can see, why would they move from here to there? Oh, I see. That's what's going on. And maybe the narrative in the book will help you explain that.
I'll ask one last question before we go, since we're still here. Donna asked, what surprised you the most when you saw the data? It's kind of like asking, who's your favorite child, isn't it?
All right. I knew at the beginning that the South was about movement. I didn't realize that it had, so we think of the 1930s as being the sort of, the sharecroppers. That was one of the least mobile times in Southern history. Because if you lived on a farm, you're going to stay there. You can feed yourself on a farm. You move to Birmingham, you might starve, right? So it's the correlation between movement and prosperity in some ways, is that generally people are not moving because they're poor. They're moving because they're poor and there's maybe a better chance in town or in the city or up north or out west or at the defense plant on the coast. These are, when you sometimes will see these fMRIs of brains and the blood going to the areas where the activity is. This is showing where people are learning where opportunity lies and going there. That's generally, these are maps of people seeking the American dream. And that's an inspiring thing to know. So I guess what I was surprised most is how much there was. The South was keeping up with it, with the rest of it. And to see now that the South is the place where people are moving to is building on a long tradition.
And Mark just posted in the chat box a quote that you should probably use your book jacket. Is this book will make you go back and look at maps and look at old maps in 100 different ways. This is a gift for all genealogists and folks interested in their complete story.
Thanks very much, Mark. We've not met in person, but I like you a lot, my friend. We're good friends. All right.
Okay. Thank you very much. This is fabulous. It was enjoyed by all.
Thanks very much, everybody. It's great. Good luck with your work. And if you happen to see any of my relatives, let me know. I haven't tracked them down. Goodbye.
Thank you.